It's a morning of mispronouncing names. It's a McCuit, but everybody's going to get sick of this picture by the end of today. This is the iconographic picture of Sherborn, and it's actually in his last years, and as Neil pointed out, it's rather staged. And I want to talk about leading up to this picture. My title, according to the program, reads Charles Sherborn and the Naming and Necessity, Sherborn's Context in the Late 19th Century. But I'm going to stretch it back a bit to the early decades of the 19th century, to the very groundwork of modern taxonomy, systematics, and nomenclatural practice. For it is there that in those ruckuses of early Victorian biology and zoology that it will set the stage, or better, release the hounds or the anchor, whatever metaphor we're going to use today, of all the later disputes, including the ones that are with us today. We're all going to get established in the early 19th century. Those early Victorians knew the value of names, often couching in monetaristic fashion. Here's a William Kirby at the foundational address of the Zoological Club of the Linnean Society. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he's establishing that names, when a thing is named, it has now value. When once an animal subject is named, it describes, it becomes a possession forever, and the value of every individual specimen of it, even in a mercantile view, is enhanced. Now, this is matched by the words the radical anatomist Robert Grant in his presentation to the Parliamentary Commission on the Affairs of the British Museum in 1835 and 1836. He presented to the Parliamentary Commission an object, he says, may not be the value of a farthing until it's identified and properly named. Its value may be raised to 30, 40, 50 guineas, even though it has not gained an ounce once it's named. Now, both these expressed these issues about the value of names in a period of nomenclatorial turmoil and the establishment of stability and an anchor. First, Kirby presented in that radical new club of the Linnean Society, which harbored those who aimed to break the hold of Linnaeus over systematics and meaning, and to introduce new systems, often imported from France, to break the hold of the Linnaean world system. Robert Grant, as a radical calling for the overthrow of all received systems, was himself a Lamarckian, an evolutionist and political radical before Darwin. These are presented in Reform Bill Britain, where democratic forces threatened Tory privileges, much the same as they are doing now at St. Paul's. Any conference on nomenclature and its problems and its history will harken back to the pioneering document, the founding creed of nomenclatural rules, and that is the Code of Zoological Nomenclature of 1842, drafted by Hugh Edwin Strickland under the patronage of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, Strickland's committee was a veritable who's who of British natural history. Henslow, Jennings, William Ogilvie, J.O. Westwood, Richard Owen, William Yarrell, W.E. Schuchard, G.R. Waterhouse, convening its meetings in Darwin's house, who still lived in London at the time. Now, here is an early draft of Strickland's rules. Courtesy, all the papers are collected at the Zoological Museum, Cambridge University. And this is the first draft that Strickland composed, and then the committees were to comment on it. This is Darwin's and Ogilvie's comments on the original document of what should be changed or what should be kept in. Now, I can't overemphasize the importance of these rules as a founding document. They are the very first attempt at an international code of language in any science. Any modern code, whether botanical or zoological, can trace their direct ancestry to this code. And many or most of the structures, and some would say here probably some of the problems of modern zoological nomenclature, can be traced directly to this code and its rules. But I want to stop and spend a few moments on the very peculiarities of this document and its inheritance, and unpack it a bit and also give it some grounding for Sherborn and his monumental project. The Strickland rules, as you would see if you read them, again, you probably can't read them from the front row, never mind the back row, start with a series of paragraphs on the philosophy of language, a very detailed account of the philosophy of language. This here is a remarkable reading of Lockean views of naming and reference, which were in contention in Britain at this very time between followers of William Whewell, who had an entirely different understanding of the way things were named, and the followers of John Locke, who had this sort of view of the meaning of meaning. Strickland himself had written numerously and voluminously on the notion of language, on the meaning and use of names. I'm going to outline quickly what it says here. Strickland says, words are only conventional signs. And they follow it immediately with the sentence that says, this should be enough to check those who are constantly trying to subvert the language of zoology. Names, he continues, do not capture essences. They are not definitions. So how do they get authority and reference? By first dubbing, he says. Not by accurately capturing any meaning or sense, but rather that very first dubbing. These rules, then, it continues on the very first page of the Rules of Zoological Nomenclature, are about dubbing, about disciplining that dubbing. Now, this is a remarkable start for a set of rules of zoological nomenclature, and is only understandable in the face of the radical attempts all through the early 19th century and today to radically alter the words or names of things to match their scientific place and practice, to have names capture the reform and meaning of science. Strickland had cut his teeth in fighting such radical attempts, and there are legion in the early 19th century of attempts to try to entirely reform the whole system of zoology and to adjust the names of things to match that reform. Strickland's biggest enemy was Neville Wood, who was a popular writer, ornithologist, and eventually one of the leaders of alternative medicine in late 19th century. Neville Wood would write, it is essential that the improvement of ornithological science, that names be frequently altered, for when a new system is proposed, and there are few who would advocate the Linnaean system now, new names must necessarily be introduced. And new systems abounded. If anybody's a historian of early 19th century zoology and natural history, you see there's bifurcating systems and quinarian systems and cuvarians. All of them are associating the new names that they're establishing to match their system. But for Strickland, names are arbitrary dubbings that hold on to that reference irrespective of the meanings of the systems to which they belong. But asked Strickland, if there is a first dubbing, where is it to occur? Strickland, somewhat traversally and contravening his very philosophy, gives an arbitrary date of the 12th edition of Linnaeus' System of Nature, where we find, he thinks, the solidification of binomial nomenclature. And it's from that moment that the dubbing of names is to begin. It is here that Strickland and his rules introduces the law of priority. The very first rule states the name originally given by the founder of a group or the describer of a species should be permanently retained. Here the rules are giving rules for procedure and not names themselves. The rest of the code outlines where such descriptions can be found, published in certain received authoritative journals and books, and not in popular press. All aim to keep at bay amateur zoologists and ornithologists from establishing new names willy-nilly and reforming the very nature of the anchor of zoological discourse. And so Strickland kept the debates about meaning at bay. But notice how that brings up the issue of priority and genealogy. Now, I should point out a bit of trivia. The British Association for Advancement of Science rules of 1842, which we often say are the British Association for Advancement of Science rules, 1842, were not actually passed by the British Association for Advancement of Science. They were cleverly inserted by Strickland into the report of 1842, but they were not accepted by the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Why? Because there's enormous opposition to the first rules, and the opposition came from exactly here, or Bloomington, or up north, right, from here. The strongest opposition came from John Edward Gray. It is Gray who kept them from being adopted. Gray was by then the chief keeper of zoology at the British Museum. And Gray was adamant that these rules should not be established to control the nature of discourse in natural history. Why? Because he was at exactly the same time establishing a different site of authority for naming and discourse in natural history. For while the rules were being established, Gray was working on his own solution to systematic and nomenclatural anarchy, his own material anchor to the biodiversity problem. For Gray, the British Museum catalogues of types would establish main names and reference and be the site of authority. Not some regulatory rules, but actually real concrete catalogues that solidify the names. Now, interesting, this huge fight between rules and museum continued into the middle of the 19th century. Gray used the anarchy that seemed to exist in zoology as a way to lobby aristocratic trustees of the British Museum to publish, of which they were originally reluctant to publish the catalogues, and to establish them as the authority for worldwide speaking of species and types. The huge fight had its resolution, in a certain sense, in Darwin. Darwin's monograph on barnacles is the very first to explicitly use the Strickland rules, and it's also the first to use the new Gray catalogues, which began publication in the 1840s. It's Darwin that tries to make a unification of the authority of the catalogues and the rules of zoological nomenclature established by the committee of which he was a member. It's not entirely successful, as we know. It's an uneasy compromise which ran through into the late 19th century. But it's probably here, not up at Bloomsbury, but down here in South Kensington, probably in this very room, but I think this is a 1950s room, right, rather than a 19th century room. It's at the British Museum that the next brick in the nomenclatural debate took place, where the very seeds of Sherborn's great project get sown. And this is at the museum now that it's moved to South Kensington, and it's the visit of the great and controversial American zoologist who has already been mentioned in Neil's talk, Elliott Coues, and his partner in crime, Joel Allen. I love Coues. They're both very humorous, playful zoologists and ornithologists. Coues, when asked often, how do you pronounce his name, since we're talking about name pronunciations, said, it is from my Scottish ancestry, and it's pronounced like cow, meaning coo, right? And Americans were puzzled by this, could not figure at all what was going on. The visit of the great and controversial American zoologist Elliott Coues on tour of Europe to check out all the spiritualist sites. He's a spiritualist. Allen was a Lamarckian. But also to advocate for new methods of American field ornithology against the stodgy museum cloisters like the ones found here in the British Museum. It's Coues and Allen who, grounded on their field ornithology, started to create the plans for a new rules of ornithological nomenclature, produced by Coues and his colleagues, Joel Allen and the American Ornithologists Union. The main innovation of the OAU, which is basically grounded on Strickland's rules, except for one striking addition, to introduce the subspecies names based on geographical distribution. Organisms were now to be identified by a trinomial, which would identify the geographical location of the organism, and this would be what the name of an organism happens to be. For the British, this was an utter travesty that they were ignorant Americans, to use the director of the Museum Flower at that time's account of what the Americans were doing, and that it promised a return to anarchy. Why? Well, for the British, it was clearly mixing up, again, it was negating the original philosophy of Locke of naming, of first dubbing, and mixing up naming and meaning, violating all that had been achieved in establishing a system-free nomenclatural authority. And so on July 1st, 1884, at a session in this very room, Coues presented his theory, and his new method of nomenclature trinomialism. Here is a report from Nature of that meeting in the British Museum. Every British zoologist of note was there, led by William Flower, the director of the museum, Schlater, Boulder Sharp, Gunter, the now keeper of the zoology. Huxley himself sent a note saying he couldn't attend, but give him hell. And all were there to give Coues and the upstart Americans a piece of their mind and defend their rules and their museum. Surprising the session, which all the verbatim report is actually given in Nature, and it's quite interesting from a philosophical point of view, because all the debates, early debates of the 19th century, are rehearsed once again in 1884, and I'm sure they're rehearsed over and over again in the International Commission of Zoological Nomenclature about the meaning of language, of dubbing, and authority, and the fears of anarchy that would be introduced by rejigging the whole of the meaning of zoological nomenclature. The claim was by the British that trinomials, by identifying location in the name, were giving meaning and liable to abuse and destabilize our system of authority so deeply established by rules and by the museum. Coups attempted to fight back, but to no avail. The meeting was raucous and great fun, and Coups was sent lipping. The debate itself lasted long past that Tuesday, July 1st, and continued in the press and in the scientific journals for the most of the rest of the year. Now, recently employed by the geologist Thomas Jones at the British Museum, who was possibly attending, I'd like to think that he was attending the raucous session, was the 23-year-old Charles Davies Sherborn. He had already shown a predilection for indexing. What we have seen Elliot Coups try to provoke him by saying that only an inspired idiot could perform such a work. And with the inspiration of Flower, Gunter, Slater, and others, Sherborn publishes the announcement of the project for his great work in the May 1890 issue of Nature. As stated in that announcement, the index was to be built on binomials alone. He would write constantly, if something is identified as a trinomial, it's not a name. It's alphabetized by species. And the philosophical rule of priority of first dubbing, now from the 12th edition of Linnaeus, was to apply. The index was to be a deciding foundation to the problematic first presented by an attempt to anchor zoological discourse in a philosophy of language and a method of grounding and dubbing. It wore its origins and genealogy proudly. As Sherborn stated later in life, there are only this is in a letter to the head of the Scripps Museum or Institute in the United States. There are only 2 rules any good. And this was written exactly at the time that we see that iconographic picture at of the ancient Sherborn. After all this work, there are only 2 rules any good, he would write. Priority, which dates from the 1st of January 1758, and the second is that the first trivial is the type. If the generic diagnosis does not agree, then so much for the worst for the genus, and it must be revived. I was hoping that there would be a philosopher or 2 in the audience, because I'm one. Naming Necessity, very famous work by Saul Crickey, who establishes against meaning notions or definitional notions of meaning that there is a first causal dubbing that locks on to the meaning to the referent of the term, irrespective of the various definitions that come with it. Right? And this was a great revelation to some when it was announced in the philosophical community in the last century, that is the 20th century, and it became almost a mark of scholastic endeavor to try to figure out what that exactly meant. But he, being not a historian of philosophy, forgot that there was a debate about this very issue happening in the early 19th century, of which Strickland and his friends, including Darwin, came down very strongly in the notion of dubbing. And because it's so normal to us now, especially in zoological nomenclature, to think that, it's actually a radical view at that time. As you know, Linnaeus overthrew the notion that there had to be a diagnosis or a definition as a naming of something that was in Nicene Ray. But to become a philosophical ground happens right at the time dubbing, irrespective of how the definitions might work of those names, is extremely important to that first zoological code. And philosophers have a gold mine to look at the correspondence and the debate about what is the meaning of meaning that goes on in the early 19th century.
I might have got this the wrong way round, but in the context of names of meaning, wasn't it Darwin who did thrust a meaning upon names?
No. It's hard to summarize this in a few sentences because I've written a whole book on it, and it is. So the answer is no. Darwin himself participated in this code in a knowledge that what he was doing was radically changing the meanings of the terms. Right? What is a species? What happens to be the individual species that they're referring to as taxon? And that he knew that that was becoming unpacked. Those before him, like the followers of Lamarck, had done the same thing, changed the meaning of the terms, but they thought that the names themselves had to be changed at the same time. And Darwin knew what kind of anarchy that would create for the cluster, I guess, of zoologists and natural historians of which he was a member, and that some sort of authority had to be established. And so when many people are pressing to him, what is your definition of species? What's your proper definition of species? It wasn't anything like the biological species concept, which we debate about endlessly nowadays. He just says, I give it up. Give your own definition, but it is the dubbing that matters. And that to know what it is that we're dubbing is not established by a hard and fast definition, and then he uses something that he gets from Whewell in the history of inductive sciences and says this is established